Hello guys, Wave Nunnally with Bible Unplugged. Welcome back to another episode. We have just completed a 8-part series on Jesus' most famous and longest public address known as the Sermon on the Mount. And there are a lot of components in that sermon, in that communication, that led me to want to dive a little bit more deeply into this most incredible mind that the world has ever known, and to really take a look at some of the things that make Jesus' teachings pop for the first century audience. And what I'm hoping, after we've gone through and jumped through the hoops in this session, will make those communications really pop for us as well. So we're moving into a 4-part series called The Genius of Jesus. And today, what I want to look at is Jesus' use of literary forms. Now, I know that automatically, right out of the chute, that sounds really nerdy and takes you back to maybe a 10th or 11th grade English class. But trust me, his use of literary forms and the way that we're going to look at his sentences are not like the way that you used to be forced to do sentence diagramming and that kind of thing. Communication of Jesus is much more dynamic than that, and we're going to see that as we process through the material. Now, when we talk about Jesus' use of literary forms or literary devices, there are tons of them. Here's an abbreviated list. Often Jesus will speak in parable. We're told by scholars that somewhere between 40 and 70 parables Jesus uttered during his earthly ministry that are recorded in the Gospels. Parables that you know of probably quite well, like the parable of the Good Samaritan or the lost sheep or the lost coin. Jesus also uses direct address, and we just looked at this in an 8-part series on the Sermon on the Mount, where he is just firing off for 3 full chapters. He also uses prophetic prediction. In Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, he predicts his own death 3 different times and uses a prophetic formula that sounds a lot like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. He'll also use a prophetic warning type of device. You'll see this in Matthew 23, for example, where 7 different times he says, "Woe to you, people who are being like this or doing this." The woe formula. He'll also use wordplay. So he'll say, don't cast your pearls before swine. The word swine in Hebrew is chazirim, lest they turn chozrim and trample you. Chazirim, chozrim. So Jesus is not above using wordplay, and that connects with his audience. He'll also use idiomatic expressions and figures of speech, like laying up your treasures on earth and laying up your treasures in heaven, which is used in literature between Malachi and Matthew, between the Testaments. He'll also use hyperbole. Woe to you who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Hyperbole. It's exaggeration for the purpose of making a point. He'll also use things like sarcasm and humor. He, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew says, "Woe to you who say that whoever swears by the temple, his oath isn't binding, but if he swears by the gold on the temple, then his oath is binding." He's making a funny there because Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, tells us that Herod sort of installed golden spikes along the top of the Holy of Holies because pigeons kept being there and roosting and then defiling the court of sacrifice with their droppings. So he's using a popular problem and solution, then a reference to the gold on the temple as making a funny and sort of using it in sarcasm against those that were in opposition or opposed to simple oath-taking and the gold versus the temple. What I want to talk to you about, though, today, what I want us to look at in detail is Jesus' use of a literary formula or a literary device called poetic parallelism, sometimes more largely talked about as Hebrew poetic parallelism or Hebraic poetic parallelism. And I'd like to start by zooming in on one of Jesus' stops as he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. The name of the place is Magdala or Magdala. Likely the home of Mary Magdalene that we find in the Gospels. So if you're looking at the picture, you have some beautiful farmland in the foreground, and then there is a cut between two mountains, Mount Nitai and Mount Arbel, that leads you down onto a very fertile plain. Then you see the Sea of Galilee, and all the way to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, the beginning of the Golan Heights. Well, back on this fertile plain that is directly adjacent to the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, that plain is called the Plain of Gennesaret. And that's exactly where we find the city of Magdala, tucked in behind Mount Arbel and right on the very seashore of the Sea of Galilee. So in 2009, there was a group of Mexican Catholics who were leveling off the area and bulldozing trees and the like in order to prepare the ground to build a retreat center. Instead, what they found was an ancient city. That ancient city had not been inhabited since the 1st century AD. It was destroyed by the Romans in the spring of 68 or late 67. And this is the home of Mary Magdalene. In so doing, they also uncovered a beautiful 1st century synagogue, literally a time capsule from the 1st century where people gathered together every Shabbat and often throughout the week to worship and to study. A synagogue from the 1st century, likely a synagogue that Jesus visited. At one point, sometime earlier, we did an entire session on the city of Magdala and focused on the synagogue. But what I wanted to focus on today is simply the internal components of the synagogue. Around the edges, the outer wall, you see benches where people would sit. This was standard architecture and standard seating for 1st century synagogues. However, this synagogue had another feature that lots of other synagogues that have been discovered from later time periods did not include. It includes a set of seats inside of the other seats that run around the outer wall. These seats were most closely connected to the top of a pulpit that was used for the reading of the Torah. And so these people got to be right up close to the action, what we would call the box seats of today, the seats that were really reserved for the fat cats. Here's a close-up of the same. We're now inside the synagogue. You can see the mosaic floor. You can see the beautiful columns that have still some of the 1st century plaster and painting on that plaster called fresco that was put in place in the 1st century AD. So now we're on the inside of the synagogue. You can see the bench seats around the edge, and then you can see the box seats most closely connected to the top of this pulpit where the Torah was read and expounded in the 1st century AD, likely one that Jesus even used. Here's another perspective on that, and you can see very clearly the inner seating as opposed to the outer seating. Jesus uses this as an example in his teaching. He said, they love the place of honor at the banquets. And then he says, more or less, makes the same point using different words as he passes by a second time. And the chief seats, just like place of honor, they love the place of honor and the chief seats in the synagogue. So what I've done in formatting this in poetic parallelism is to underline these common parts and then yellow these common parts. So the place of honor and the chief seats is making the same point. The banquets and the synagogues is making the same point. These are people who love the limelight when they're out in public. Get that? So Jesus has basically made the same point two different ways. This is a great example of Hebrew poetic parallelism. Now, where would Jesus have gotten such an idea? Did he create this literary device or this literary form or formula? The answer is no. Evidently, Jesus got this because he was so exposed, so often exposed, so deeply exposed to the literature in his own Bible. And we're talking there about the Hebrew Bible, or what we in the West usually call the Old Testament. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of this in the Hebrew Bible, just to make sure that we're on solid ground when we make that point, that Jesus was majorly influenced by the most outstanding literary form in his Bible. So we get in Isaiah chapter 1, "Alas, O nation, sinful nation, people weighted down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly." So I've underlined the points in common, different ways of saying the same thing. Nation, people, offspring, sons. They're all basically synonymous. This is synonymous poetic parallelism. And then these people are sinful, full of iniquity, they're evildoers, and they act corruptly. All of this in yellow is making the same point. So in four different ways, the prophet Isaiah has basically stated the same thing. Now look at the second part of the verse. They have abandoned Yahweh. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from Him. So in the green here, all of these are synonymous. Abandoned, despised, and turned their backs on, or turned away from. And then the blue, all the same thing. Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, and Him, a pronoun referring to God Himself. Look, these are all poetically parallel, and they're all synonymous. So this is a beautiful example from one of the most famous poets in the Hebrew Bible, heavily influenced Jesus and his teaching, and we've got this right at the beginning of the book of Isaiah. Now let's look at another book in the Hebrew Bible that also Jesus quotes from. It's quoted lots of times in the New Testament. This is a front and center book from the Hebrew Bible, the book of Psalms. And here we get this beautiful picture of the person who has found himself in deep trouble, surrounded by enemies, being put to death. I stare at my bones. My mouth is dried up. And here in the book of Psalms, it says, "And yet I've come to realize," the psalmist says, "that God has not despised, nor has He abhorred the affliction of the afflicted." These verbs are poetically parallel. To despise and to abhor, they both mean to hate. "Nor has He hidden His face from." So what this means, if it's all in poetically parallel position, to despise, to abhor, to turn your back from or hide your face from Him. Now, I just want to point out, yes, this is all poetically parallel, but it's really interesting that Jesus quotes this same psalm from the cross. When He begins the psalm, He just starts it out and expects everybody else to run to this point, at least toward the end of the psalm, when He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You keep following that thought and you realize the same thing that this psalmist realized, that David realized, that even though it looked like and he felt like and he thought that God had abandoned him, in reality, God had never turned His back on him. That's also true of Jesus on the cross, and thank God for it, because had God turned His back on that final sacrifice, we would all still be dead and in our sins. I wrote an article on that, Did God Abandon Jesus on the Cross? Feel free to Google that, read it in full, take a look at it, follow the argumentation, and see if you agree. Because many people in many pulpits and many lecterns today, teachers and pastors, writers as well, have taken this position that God turned His back on Jesus, could not look at the final sacrifice that Jesus offered on the cross. Then we have, at the end of this passage in Psalm 22, all the ends of the earth and all of the families of the nations. Poetically parallel? Absolutely. Will remember and turn to the Lord. Will worship before you. Poetically parallel? Yes. And then finally in verse 28, for the kingdom is Yahweh's, and He rules over the nations. It's basically making the same point, using a different set of words each time. So whether it's Isaiah, the Psalms, the book of Job, the book of Micah, it doesn't make any difference. You pick one in the Hebrew Bible, most often you're going to find Hebrew poetic parallelism. So this definitely does impact the teachings of Jesus, His mentality, His thought world, and how He communicates to people in the first century AD. So I'll tell you what, let's take a look at some of Jesus' other poetic parallels. In fact, let's look at enough of them to recognize, yes, this is a major feature of Jesus' teaching. And if I simply learn to track with Him, then I'm going to get more out of my Bible study. I'm going to get more out of my devotional reading. I'll get more out of my, serious study with other people, home groups or small fellowship groups. And I will be able to bring more to the table, understanding Jesus from His original point of view, His original perspective. Matthew chapter 8, we're going to start simple, and then we'll get more complex, more difficult as we go through some examples from Jesus' teaching. In Matthew chapter 8, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. Well, I've underlined the poetically parallel point, foxes and birds, and then I've yellowed holes and nests. This is just the way that Jesus decides to compare the animal kingdom with, but the Son of Man has no place to lay His head. That beautiful teaching about the nature of the poverty of Jesus, the fact that He's humbled Himself to that point, using the animal kingdom, integrating that, and then speaking in Hebrew poetic parallelism. This is just a beautiful example, a very simple example of that. Here's another simple example. And by the way, this is from the Sermon on the Mount. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles. Or, so you have grapes and figs, poetically parallel. You have the from and the from. Interestingly, the phrase not gathered from, or not gathered from, is used elliptically here, just like we saw ellipsis in Isaiah and in Psalms. The verb is borrowed from one line and assumed in the next line. That's another great literary device, a literary form that is beautiful, that Jesus has learned from His national literature and is incorporating in His own teaching. And then the from is obviously, parallel, and then thorns. The bushes is added by the editor. This is plural. Thorns and thistles. Beautiful poetic parallel in the original language of Jesus. Here's another example. Do not give, and then do not throw. What is holy and your pearls, that which is precious. Don't give what is holy to dogs, poetically parallel with swine. So, big picture, do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine. A beautiful, in every component part of these two statements, beautiful Hebrew poetic parallelism. So a great example for us to study when we're trying to get on board with one of the primary literary features that Jesus uses whenever He is teaching publicly and verbally. Matthew chapter 5, verse 42. Give to him who asks of you. Do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Hopefully at this point you've gotten used to the underlining and the capital letters and the different use of different colors, and you can see that give and don't turn away from. To him and from him. Asks and wants to borrow. Of you, from you. Everything is a beautiful poetic parallelism. So he's simply, again, making the same point two different ways. So if you miss it and you doze off or don't understand the words of the first line, you get the same point in the second line. If something is unclear in the first line, like the use of a word or some idiomatic expression, some figure of speech, then you're going to pick up in its parallel the same point that Jesus is making. Here's another beautiful one, very simple one. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent. Kills and stones, poetically parallel. The prophets and those that God sends to as His spokespersons to the city of Jerusalem. Another beautiful poetic parallelism. By the way, yes, we've got Jerusalem in the background and the Mount of Olives in the foreground in the eye candy at the bottom of the page. So here's another example, and now what we're going to do is go from simple to a little bit more complex. Notice we have more than 2 lines on this. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and elliptically used or borrowed from the next. We sang a dirge for you, and you did not mourn. So what are the poetic parallels? Played the flute and sang a dirge. In other words, we sang some really joyful, we played some joyful music for you, and then we sang a very mournful song. But when we played happy music, then you didn't respond happily with the dance. And when we sang a mournful song, then you did not mourn. A beautiful way. We call it A-B, poetic parallelism, where this line is parallel with the 3rd line and the 2nd line is parallel with the 4th line. Jesus is doing some amazingly creative things here, guys. And if we stand up and take note, if we arm ourselves with or equip ourselves with these tools for better understanding God's Word when we go to it to study, when we hear it read in a sermon, when we hear it on the radio, quoted or whatever, we're bringing more to the table and we get more consequently out of it as a result. Here's another example. Again, it's a little bit more complicated. We've got 4 lines here like the previous. He causes His sun, speaking of God, He causes His sun to rise, and then He says, on the evil and the good. God's taking care of all of His creation. Good people, bad people. People who do evil things, people who do good things. And then now we get the poetic parallel. And He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. With the use of underlining and color and stuff like that, I hope that you're seeing how easy it is to connect the dots. He causes and He sends His sun and rain that comes from Him. And then we have the evil and the unrighteous. And then he's sort of making a cross here. The evil and the unrighteous, and then the good and the righteous. He's made the same point 2 different ways by referencing sun and rain and good people who live their lives appropriately and people who are renegades. It's just a beautiful way of making the point 2 different ways. And this is getting a little bit more complex. You noticed the way he reversed the order of things in A1 and B1. Just really beautiful stuff that demonstrates the genius, the literary genius, the communicative genius of Jesus in reusing a literary form found in His own Bible. Here's another one. Again, a 4-liner. This also comes from the Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve 2 masters. You know, you probably, some of these passages, you knew already and could probably quote much of these passages by heart. And yet now as we're digging deeper into the structure of the material, it's coming to mean more to us. I hope that that is the case with you as well. No one can serve 2 masters. This is A-B-B-A. A moment ago we had A-B-A-B. This is a little bit different way of structuring your parallelism, but also incredibly beautiful. No one can serve 2 masters. He will either hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and mammon. Mammon is a Hebrew word that means possessions. Doesn't just mean money, it means lands, it means stocks and bonds, it means anything that you own that belongs to you. And so we cannot, Jesus says, serve 2 masters at the same time. That just wouldn't make sense in His world. And those 2 masters, the serve and the serve, go together. The A and the A1 work together. serve and serve. No one can serve two masters. Well, who are those two masters? Somebody's sitting there and they're halfway dozing off. They're tired. They worked hard that day or whatever. And Jesus doubles down on it and he says, let me tell you exactly what I'm talking about. This is where poetic parallelism, one passage or one part of the poetic parallelism, clarifies the intended meaning of the other part. So who are the two masters? God and stuff. God and stuff, the part that's underlined. And then hate and despise are juxtaposed or compared to love and cling to or hold on to, desperately grasp upon someone. So this is just another example of beautiful poetic parallelism. Here's one in the Gospel of Luke. We, by the way, just discussed this in our discussion in our series on the Sermon on the Mount. And it says, do not judge, Jesus says, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. This is a more beautiful poetic parallelism. And what he's doing is, as he cascades down through these 6 lines, he is clarifying what kind of judging he means. He doesn't mean, look, you can't decide what color car you want. You just got to take whatever they give you. You can't decide who you're going to marry or where you're going to live or what house you're going to buy, or what job you're going to take, or what major you're going to pursue in college. He's not talking about suspending all of your critical thinking. What he's talking about is this judging that he's talking about is condemnatory judgment that is unforgiving, that is unhelpful, that's not restorative in nature, but rather is rejecting in nature. So yes, we are responsible, required to by Jesus. If we read that full passage in Matthew chapter 7, the entire passage, we get the same point. And so Luke is providing for us, preserving the words of Jesus, where one part of the poetic parallelism clarifies, helps us to come to better, clearer understanding of the other parts. Well, what exactly do you mean by judging? Jesus says, let me tell you exactly what I mean, what I don't want you to engage in. Condemnatory, unrestorative, unreconciling, destructive judgment. Here's another one. And again, we're going from the less complex to the more complex. Notice they're getting longer. Your eye candy here in the upper right is a picture from the model of Jerusalem that we use extensively when we are studying together in the land. We'll spend an hour or two working with this almost 1 acre model of the city of Jerusalem as it existed largely in Jesus' day and right before it was destroyed in AD 70. So Jesus says here in Matthew 7, enter by the narrow gate. And now the parallelisms start. This is just sort of an introductory statement. He says, the gate is wide. That's to be compared to the gate is small. Down, see the B and then the B1. The gate is wide and the gate is small. Well, the gate is wide for what? And the way is broad. Oh, there's a parallel with a comparison with the way is narrow. Broad, narrow. Wide, small. For the gate is wide, the way is broad, that leads to destruction. Leads to destruction. That is in parallel position with, it's kind of a parallel that's the exact opposite. And so that leads to destruction is parallel with that leads to life. One gate leads to destruction, the other gate leads to life. And then in the very middle, and this often, at least in the Hebrew Bible, when you get to that middle point, that is the point that is being emphasized. It's often called chiastic structure. But he says, and many are those who enter by it. This is the warning that Jesus is giving. There are a lot of people who are going to go the way of destruction. They will not find abundant life here or eternal life there. Jesus is uttering this then as a warning. It's the sort of the hinge point, the key point of the entire parallelism. Many are those who enter by it. Don't be one of those. Don't follow after a multitude to do evil. Don't follow after the majority. They're usually wrong. And he says, many are those who enter by it. And then that's compared to few there are who find it. Find what? the narrow gate, the way that leads to life. So let's look at the poetic parallelisms here. The gate is wide as opposed to the gate is small. The way is broad as opposed to the way is narrow. That leads to life is poetically in comparison to that leads to life, to destruction and life. Leads to destruction and leads to life. And many there are who go by it. That doesn't even have a parallel, except when you get to the very bottom. Few there are that find it. This, by the way, is a teaching of Jesus, a precious teaching of Jesus, included in the Gospels, included in the New Testament, in our Bible, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that is going in the exact opposite direction of most prophecy teachers and many other popular teachers who say that the end of time is going to be marked by a great sweeping end time revival. Much of Jesus' saying is going to move in the exact opposite direction. We've got to follow Him rather than following the majority of voices, even within the Christian community. We have then, many there are who enter by it. And the gate is small that leads, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few there are who find it. Let's go to the next text. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust can destroy, and where thieves can break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Another lengthy poetic parallelism, but let's dig into it. Lay up for yourselves treasures in A and then in A1, but lay up for yourselves treasures. Well, what's the difference? Don't lay up treasures on earth, but lay up treasures in heaven. Those are supposed to be pancaked together. Jesus' original audience, Jesus Himself, would have intended us and them, the original audience, to make this connection. Well, why not store up treasure, lay up treasure? By the way, that's a really interesting turn of phrase or idiom or figure of speech. Why not lay up treasure on earth? Because moth and rust can destroy, and thieves can break in and steal. Moth and rust, break in and steal. Two different component parts, those go together. They also go with where, if you lay up for your treasure in heaven, the opposite of laying up treasure on earth, then Jesus says moth and rust cannot destroy. Thieves, notice the thieves and the thieves cannot break in, or steal. So this is another beautiful way of saying the same thing, kind of two different sides of the same coin. Saying the same thing two different ways and grinding his point in, bringing that point to bear so that this is a memorable moment in the lives of people who hear him. Hopefully a memorable moment in the lives of those like us 21 centuries later who are reading him. Now Jesus will say this, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary." And notice right below that, I've got the weary underlined and heavy laden. Two ways of saying the same thing. So we've got to assume that this is poetic parallelism. He says, "I will give you rest." Notice the B and then the B1. "And you will find rest for your souls." He's making the same point. So in between that, he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Take my yoke means to learn from Jesus. We have to assume that. Jesus has constructed it in this way. That what is it? He's defining his terms. What does it mean to take the yoke of Jesus? It means to learn from him. That's exactly what we're engaged in right now, by the way. And when you're doing your own Bible study, and when you're listening to a sermon, or reading some devotional literature, or whatever, we are learning from him. Take my yoke, not the yoke of someone else. Take my yoke, Jesus says. Learn from me. So the emphasis is on us submitting to his mastery, to his lordship. If we do that, even though we may have been previously weary or heavy laden, he promises us rest. And then he says, if you'll take my yoke, if you'll learn from me, you will find rest for your souls. By the way, this "for your souls" should be read in up here elliptically. And Jesus is talking about giving us rest not from our weekly work, not from our 40-hour job, not from having to cut the grass or paint our house when it needs to be. He's not going to turn us into slobs. He is going to give our souls rest. And that one little addition down here in B1 helps define what Jesus meant back up in his original point about giving us rest. Now, how is he going to do this? What is his yoke like? He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Another beautiful parallelism just within itself, just within these last two lines. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. And you can see with the green and then the underline that these are beautifully, poetically parallel. So, as we've studied a bunch of different examples from the lips of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, how does this help us to better understand Jesus? Because, we talk about all the time, I just want to know Jesus better. Okay, well, here's a great way of getting to know Jesus better. If we leave it in that amorphous way, it doesn't really challenge us. I just want to know Him. The Gnostics did that in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD. They just wanted a deeper spirituality, but what they ended up discovering was a Jesus who never existed. They wrote their own Gospels, they broke off from the apostolically led church, and they ended up in incredible error. Epiphanius, one of the early writers of the church in the early 300s, he said the Gnostics have gone looking for a Jesus who never existed, and in so doing they lost the only Jesus who really did exist. Well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to just do the bumper sticker theology. I just want to get to know Jesus better. Let's really get to know Him better. How does He communicate? And when we do, we get to know Him better. So this is one way. How do we get to know Him better and appreciate His genius even more deeply? Revere Him, venerate Him, respect Him, acknowledge His greatness. One of the ways is to see how He operates when He is communicating and He's hitting on all 6 cylinders. So, how do we get that? What do we get from this study that we just engaged in? Well, we know that Jesus is intimately familiar with His Bible, the Hebrew Bible, what we call in the West the Old Testament. We know it because He not only knows the language of the Old Testament, He not only knows the Old Testament word for word and can quote it at will anytime He wants, but He also knows the literary forms of the Old Testament and begins using them, incorporating them in His own teaching. But guess what? He not only does He understand the literary forms, He also is able, He is so well versed in this that He can create His own poetic parallelisms. When He gives us poetic parallels in the Gospels of Matthew or Mark or Luke or sometimes even John, He's not quoting the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible word for word. These are things He's coming up with on His own. Originality. So He has original creativity. He's not just a gutter sparrow. He's not just a plagiarist. He's coming up with this stuff. And get this, guys, He's not using notes. He's not using a teleprompter. He's not borrowing this from some pre-written script. He is coming up with this stuff on the spot, in real time, live, and in front of, oftentimes, thousands of people. And off the cuff, He's able to come up with these amazingly complex poetic parallelisms. Here's a by the way, guys. For those of you who have studied under more liberal professors in more liberal institutions, that kind of stuff that we see Jesus doing does not happen in Greek literature. We say the Gospels are Greek. Yeah, they're translation Greek. But in the world of Greek literature, the great philosophers and the great debaters, writers of rhetoric, they don't use those kinds of literary forms. This is inherent within Jewish and Hebraic, Hebrew-based literature only. That's the reason why we see this. So forget about the Gospels being written way late and, outside the land of Israel and by non-Jewish people and stuff like that. Instead, let's start looking east instead of west, because that's where poetic parallelism occurs, and on a regular basis. So when Jesus is coming up with this is real live, true Jesus, not something the later church made up. Another thing is that we realize when we see Jesus communicating and we get down into the weeds, the details of how He's communicating, He really knows His world. Because not only is He exposed to the Hebrew Bible, so also is His audience. If His audience knows Hebrew poetic parallelism because they've heard it so often, He's going to use that to communicate with them. It's going to hit them right in the forehead. They're going to get it. They're going to understand it. And so Jesus is able then, like He uses parable, to use a pre-existing literary form to communicate with power and clarity to His audience, to His contemporaries. Another thing is that this stuff is very engaging. You saw how detailed it was. You saw how intricate the literary form can be as we moved from the simple to the more complex. And so this keeps His audience engaged. Instead of them being able to check out and daydream or whatever, they have to track with Him to get Him. They've got to move where He moves. They've got to follow His examples, His illustrations. They've got to follow His literary devices. And as they do, they are engaged in, they are a part of this communication, and it impacts them more powerfully. Can I suggest this? It will do the same to us. And then finally, when we have a passage that gives one line that is not all that clear, not 100% sure, how will He give us rest? Does that mean we just sit around and eat potato chips and drink soda pop and watch TV all the time? No, you will find rest for your souls. One line explains or clarifies the other line. And so it helps, this literary device of poetic parallelism helps Jesus to communicate more clearly and more powerfully, again, to His audience. It will do the same for us. It will function the same way for us. So, as we have taken this first shot at looking at the genius of Jesus, and we've looked at the way that Jesus constructs His material so intricately, so beautifully, sometimes so complex, we have seen the beauty of Jesus in action. We have uncovered, we have discovered, we've connected with one of the incredible aspects of the genius of Jesus. And He was an effective communicator to His generation. My hope is that as you read your Bible, He will be just as effective in communicating and just as powerful in communicating to you as well. So as you take this, maybe to some of you, new tool in your toolbox of understanding the Bible to the reading of the Gospels, you look for these. They're everywhere. That is a dominant feature in the teaching of Jesus, and enjoy it. Enjoy the journey. Enjoy the process of discovery. Enjoy getting to know Jesus better. And then that Jesus that you learn about, feel free to share that with folks around you in the coming days and weeks. God bless you richly until we see you again next time on Bible Unplugged. I pray the best, the greatest blessing of God on you as you serve Him. And by the way, quick commercial. If these kinds of studies are helping you, it's likely they'll help family members and friends and co-workers, teammates, and what have you. So please feel free to share what you're learning, where you're learning it from, and get people connected with Bible Unplugged. Until next time, God bless.